Ever wonder why some people seem to build wealth effortlessly while others just can't seem to get ahead? Well, entrepreneur Iman Gadzhi has some answers, and let me tell you, they're pretty provocative, maybe even a little confrontational. He boils it all down to 4 key reasons why he thinks people stay poor. So let's dive into his arguments and see what we can unpack here. And he really sets the tone right from the get-go with this quote. He's basically saying, hey, I'm not here to sugarcoat anything. This isn't going to be a feel-good session. It's about confrontation. It's designed to make you think, not necessarily to make you comfortable. All right, so here's the game plan. We're going to look at his 4 big ideas. First up, ego, excuses, and honesty. Then we'll get into what he calls your poor identity. After that, we'll tackle his pretty controversial take on scarcity. And we'll wrap up with this idea of being a creator versus a consumer. Okay, let's jump into his first point. And honestly, he sees this as the most important one of all. It really all boils down to one simple thing. How do you react when someone challenges you or your situation? And this is his big hook. He literally says that if the title of his video, Why You're Poor, if that triggered you, well, that's reason number 1 right there. See, for him, that defensive feeling, that's just your ego jumping in to protect itself. And he argues that's the very thing that stops you from taking a hard, honest look at your life and actually doing something about it.
So it really comes down to how you respond to reality, right? On one hand, you've got someone who can just look at a situation unemotionally and say, you know what? Yeah, that's a flaw. I can see that. But on the other hand, you have the person who immediately starts making excuses, blaming the system, blaming their boss, blaming anything and everything else, all to protect that fragile ego. And Gadzhi's whole point is that second response, that's the trap. That's what keeps people stuck. Because how can you possibly fix a problem if your ego won't even let you see it?
And this quote really just hits the nail on the head. He's basically saying the reason you're poor is that you can't look at your own life critically without taking it personally, without your ego getting all shattered. It's about that inability to separate who you are from where you are. And his core idea is this: until you can look at your bank account with the same cold, hard objectivity you'd look at a spreadsheet, you're just too emotionally tangled up to make the logical moves to change it.
So that leads us perfectly into his second big point. It's a really natural next step, you know? Once you can kind of push past that ego, the next thing you got to do is look at the very thing that ego was working so hard to protect: your identity. Because from his perspective, for a lot of people, being poor isn't just a temporary situation, it's become who they are.
And this is where he makes a really controversial point. He basically asks, look, in a world where we accept that people can change all sorts of things about their identity, why on earth do we treat our financial status like it's set in stone? His argument is that being poor isn't just something that happens to you, it's an identity that you've actually adopted, probably deep in your subconscious, without even knowing it. So you might be asking, where does an identity like that even come from? Well, he points straight to your childhood, to your programming. He tells this really personal story about his mom who grew up in the Soviet Union. Her advice was always coming from this place of scarcity, you know? Take as much as you can because you never know when you'll get more. And he says that kind of programming, it can become like a cancerous thought that just sticks with you your entire life.
But here's the thing, you can rewrite that program. For Gadzhi, his turning point was actually getting a tattoo when he was just 16. It said, "My cup runneth over." It was his way of creating a physical daily reminder to completely reject that scarcity mindset he grew up with and to force himself to adopt an identity of abundance. And here's the really crucial part of the story. He claims he did all of this before his business ever took off. The message is clear. The identity shift has to come first.
Okay, so this brings us to his third major argument, and this one is a direct attack on one of the most deeply held beliefs we all have about money, the idea that it's scarce.
Gadzhi's whole take here is that money isn't scarce at all. In fact, he says it's basically infinite. Now look, he's quick to say he's not an economist, but he points to the modern banking system as proof. In his simplified view, it works like this. First, the Federal Reserve just prints money out of thin air. Then, the government borrows that brand new money. And finally, banks get a hold of it and multiply it over and over through loans. The main point here isn't to get lost in the weeds of economics. It's to grasp one simple idea. Money is created. It's not some rare thing you have to go find.
And he uses this really great analogy to make it stick. He says, just imagine a world where the elites collected all the sand, literally just sand, and then they convinced everybody else that a single grain of sand was incredibly valuable. The sand itself is worthless and abundant, right? Its value only comes from the fact that everyone agrees it has value. And his argument is that our money today, it's no different. It's a system built on collective belief.
So, okay, what are you supposed to do with this information? Well, Gaji says you basically have two choices. You can sit on the sidelines and hate the game, or you can learn the rules and play it. He's all about playing the game. The goal, in his eyes, is to collect as much of this funny money as you can, and then immediately trade it for real, tangible assets, things that can't just be printed into worthlessness.
All right, and that brings us to his fourth and final reason. If we accept his premise that money is abundant, then the big question is, how do you actually get it? Well, the way he sees it, the answer comes down to a really simple, fundamental choice about how you spend your time.
And that question is pretty simple. Are you a consumer or are you a creator? Gaji argues that most people spend, maybe 95% of their time consuming things, scrolling social media, watching videos, you name it. And maybe only 5% of their time is spent actually creating something. The wealthy, he says, do the exact opposite. They flip that ratio on its head. They're the ones spending their time creating the very things that the masses consume.
And here's a really key insight into how this whole system works. He says that as a consumer, you're always paying the creator, and you're paying them with one of two currencies. The first one's obvious, your money. But the second one is just as valuable, if not more so today, your attention. Every single time you watch a video, scroll through a feed, or click on a link, you are spending your attention. And in our economy, both of those currencies, your money and your attention, get turned directly into wealth for the person who created the content. And really, this is the bottom line. This is the whole thing in a nutshell. You will not get rich, you will not get ahead in life until you make the shift from being someone who mostly consumes to someone who creates something that the market wants to consume. It doesn't have to be a physical product. It could be a service, it could be content like this, but the key is you have to create something of value that people are willing to trade their money or their attention for.
All right, so we've walked through all four of his arguments, from ego and identity all the way to scarcity and creation. So what's the big takeaway here? What does this all boil down to? Really, it all comes down to these four huge mindset shifts. You're moving from having a fragile ego to practicing radical honesty. You're shifting from a poor identity to a rich one. You're going from a mindset of scarcity to one of abundance. And finally, you're moving from being a consumer to becoming a creator. His whole framework is about getting off defense and going on offense. It's about taking control of the story you tell yourself and the actions you take every day. And so all of this leaves us with the one big question that he's really asking throughout this whole thing, the question you have to ask yourself. When you really, honestly look at how you spend your time, your energy, and your attention, which side of that equation are you on? Are you a creator or are you a consumer?